Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Innovate BC. It is Wednesday. It's a beautiful day. Creator has given us a beautiful day. I hope wherever you are joining from that the sun is shining. And if not, shining in real life, shining somewhere metaphorically in your world. There's always goodness around us in Creator's world. So we give thanks for the gift of another day. We give thanks that we can be here together as a virtual community. So we welcome you. My name is Michelle. I'm joining from Amiskwaciy, Waskagan, so Edmonton, Treaty 6 territory. Like I said, we got the sun shining. It is a gorgeous day. It's a beautiful fall day. I think afterwards I'm going to take a little walk and sit with Mother Earth. I hope you're able to find some time for that or some good self-care in your world today. So we're really looking forward to today's session. We got Henry joining us, and he's going to talk about the Indigenous Peoples Consensus. So 2021, we're going to hear all the results. We're going to hear what was founded. Before he comes on, we got the lovely Kathleen. She's joining us here. She also lives in Amiskwaciy, Waskagan. She's going to share a little bit about her program. So her program is the Center for Indigenous Statistics and Partnerships. So I think that that's a really good thing to learn about. I really believe, and I said this earlier this week, as I was thinking about education, as I was thinking about moments like this, where we're just really sharing knowledge and learning about what is out there. The knowledge is power. And so it's really important to take in those teachings, to share the knowledge that you have, to share what you know. So that's what this moment is all about. This is what Innovate BC is about. This is what Can Do Links to Learning is all about, is sharing the knowledge so we can become stronger and really powerful in what we do, carry out our business in a good way. So welcome. So I'm just going to pass this off to Kathleen. Kathleen, tell us about your program.
Well, first, thank you very much for that very excellent introduction, Michelle. And thank you to all of the folks at Can Do who invited us today to present to you. Henry and I are very excited to give you the 2021 census information. And thank you for acknowledging I am coming to you today from, now I'm like a little bit nervous about my pronunciation after hearing Michelle's beautiful pronunciation of Amiskwaciy, Waskagan. I'd like to, I live and work in Treaty 6 territory, and I'd like to acknowledge that it has been Indigenous land since time immemorial. And I also like to note that Edmonton is still the second highest Indigenous population in all of Canada. And we remain at, our population represents 6.27% of the Edmonton population. So that's pretty significant. And as Michelle mentioned, this is Statistics Canada, but both Henry and I work for the Center for Indigenous Statistics and Partnerships, which is a newly created division within Statistics Canada. And we have approximately 70 employees, and we all work all over Canada. Henry is coming to you from Ottawa, and I'm from Edmonton, and I represent Alberta as an Indigenous Liaison Advisor. So CISP, which is the acronym for our program, was established in 2019, and it helps Indigenous communities and organizations to build greater statistical capacity. We recognize that engagement and collaboration are essential to data collection and research activities related to Métis, Inuit, and First Nations peoples. Our mission is to provide Métis, Inuit, and First Nations communities with the statistical tools they need for better decision-making. And our vision is building and enhancing Indigenous statistical capacity information. Whoa, hang on, I'm going to say that again. Our vision is building and enhancing Indigenous statistical information and capacity through partnerships. CISP is organized into five program areas, and that includes the Indigenous Statistical Capacity Development Initiative, which is responsible for offering our suite of training programs to all Indigenous peoples, communities, and organizations throughout Canada. And we also have our Indigenous surveys and partnerships team. And we also have the Indigenous Liaison Program, which is the area where I'm employed with. That's my team. And we have an Indigenous Liaison Advisor in every province and territory in Canada. So if you need any information, basically we are the welcoming committee for you. We take whatever your concerns are and we send them up, whether it be training, presentations, capacity development, or even partnerships. We're the first stop in your journey into Statistics Canada. So, and lastly, we also have our analysis and data development team, which is the team that Henry reports to. And at this point, I will pass this off to Henry. So we look forward to your presentation, Henry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. We're glad you could pop on and give us a little description as to what you're doing. Henry, we're so honored that you're here joining us from Ottawa. So a little bit about Henry before he speaks, before he takes that virtual mic. He was born in Thunder Bay and is of mostly settler heritage. He is an economist by training and has worked at Statistics Canada with the Centre of Indigenous Statistics and Partnerships since 2017. His research covers a variety of subjects, but primarily focuses on material well-being and labor market outcomes of First Nations people, Métis and Inuit. Outside of work, he is a new father, that's exciting, a musician, also exciting, and an amateur botanist who researches rare plants in the Ottawa Valley. 3 very exciting things. So Henry, thank you so much for being here, and we're really looking forward to the knowledge, what you have discovered from 2021 statistics. So the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to start sharing my screen here. So good afternoon. As mentioned, my name is Henry Robertson, and I'm an analyst at the Centre of Indigenous Statistics and Partnerships at Statistics Canada. I'm very grateful to be joining you from Ottawa, which is part of the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. I think it's really important, especially as a settler, to reflect what it means to live and work on Algonquin Anishinaabe unceded territory. To keep close the harms that have been done, and to make sure that, you know, as a settler and as a public servant, that we move forward in the best way possible so that we don't repeat these harms from the past and current. Today, I am here to share about the new census release on First Nations peoples, Métis and Inuit. This was released a week ago, and I'm going to be giving you some of the highlights that were found. So our goal in releasing data on Indigenous peoples from the census, first, is to provide data on First Nations people, Métis and Inuit in Canada that supports the data and information needs for Indigenous governments, communities, and organizations, as well as federal partners such as Indigenous Service Canada and other organizations such as friendship centers, so forth and so on. Data should be publicly available, but we also make ourselves available for Indigenous governments and organizations to create custom tabulations. So if you need the data kind of put together in a certain way, reach out and we can make these things happen. The second thing that we do is we publish analytical products that report on the demographic, social, and economic characteristics of First Nations people, Métis and Inuit. This always needs to be done in a way that is relevant and useful, but also always provides proper context so that we don't reinforce any harmful stereotypes or anything. All our research aims to be distinctions based, focusing on, First Nations peoples separately, Métis separately, and Inuit separately, as well as going beyond just those distinctions and looking at, the differences across First Nations, within the Métis Nation, and across Inuit Nunangat and outside Inuit Nunangat as well. A bit of background on the Census of Population 2021. So Statistics Canada is required by law to conduct the Census of Population every 5 years. It provides population and dwelling counts for communities of all sizes all across Canada. The census is the primary source of socioeconomic and demographic data for specific populations groups, including Indigenous peoples. The Indigenous population, is changing over time in the socioeconomic and demographic characteristics. So it's important to see, how outcomes are evolving over time. The 2021 census of population was uniquely challenging, given the global COVID-19 pandemic, and ensuring health and safety of First Nations communities and Northern communities was an absolute priority, which at times made some challenges for in-person collection, which is what we normally do. So as part of a nation-to-nation relationship, Statistics Canada engages with First Nations through the Indigenous liaison advisors who request permissions from a First Nations chief and council members in order to collect data on reserve. In situations where complications due to COVID-19 or regional forest fires, or if a First Nation did not give permission, data could not be completed or collected in those communities. In 2021, there was 63 such communities of incompletely enumerated reserves in Canada. That was out of a total of 1,026 census subdivisions that were classified as reserves. So what this means is that when we make comparisons across time, so like with 2016 to now, we have to use what's called an adjusted base just to make sure that we're comparing the same communities across time. So there is some new content in the 2021 census. So following census engagement and conversations that took place coast to coast to coast, there was 2 new questions that were added to the Census of Population, one on membership to a Métis organization or settlement, and another on enrollment under an Inuit land claims agreement. These 2 questions were added to address information gaps that were outlined following feedback from the 2016 census. The purpose of the question on Métis membership is to provide more detail and information on the Métis Nation, on Métis population to support policies, programs in Canada, as well as for Métis individuals and organizations. The new questions make it possible to differentiate between citizens of the Métis Nation, the Métis governments that signed the Canada Métis Nation Accord, as well as members of the Alberta Métis settlements as established by the Métis Settlements Act, and Métis who are outside of these entities. The purpose of the question on enrollment under an Inuit land claims agreement is to provide detail about Inuit populations to better support evidence-based decision-making by Inuit governments and organizations and other organizations and entities as well. These 2 questions are kind of similar to a question that we've asked previously on membership to a First Nation or band, and it kind of adds a lot more detail for the Métis and Inuit population. That wasn't the only changes that happened. There were some changes in terminology. So for example, we don't ask about Indigenous or use the term Aboriginal anymore. We just simply ask, is this person First Nations, Métis, or Nook? As well, for the first time, a low income measure is available for all regions in Canada, including in the North and on reserves, whereas previously that was not the case. So the products available as of last week were some key findings. So we have like a large daily article that you go to, kind of hits, gives some points on like every subject that we covered. As well, we had 2 census and briefs, one on membership to a Métis organization or settlement, which kind of goes a bit more in detail on what some of the just initial findings are, and another one on housing conditions among Indigenous peoples. In addition to that, we published 2 infographics, one on housing and one on Indigenous peoples. We released a bunch of data tables so you can kind of go through the data yourself. As well, we have several different tools, such as ways that you can kind of visualize the data. So you can go around a map and click on, different communities, and it gives you a bunch of charts and graphs that kind of gives you information on those communities through the Focus on Geography viewer series and the Census Program viewer. We also have the census profiles for each community, each in different levels, as well as all the reference guide and materials. So data on First Nations people, Métis and Inuit in Canada. So again, this is to provide a portrait of Indigenous people and communities. And again, we'd like to thank the participation of First Nations people in Métis and Inuit. Without participation, these data would not be possible. So over 1.8 million Indigenous people were counted in the 2021 Census of Population. So Indigenous people now account for 5% of the total population in Canada, which is up from 4.9% 5 years ago in 2016. Those who reported being First Nations accounted for over half, 58% of the Indigenous population. Just over 1/3 were Métis and 3.9% were Inuit. The remaining share of the population reported either multiple Indigenous identities, such as First Nations and Métis, or were part of the Indigenous population not included elsewhere. Ontario had the highest population of Indigenous people, which you see here, but a relatively low share of the total population. I'm just going to put on my laser pointer here. Whereas Manitoba had the highest share of the Indigenous people at 18% of the total population. Almost 1 in 5 people in Manitoba is an Indigenous person, followed by Saskatchewan. Of course, percents were also higher in Nunavut, and where it was close to 85% of the population, and 85.8% of the population, and almost half the population in the Northwest Territories. This was followed by Manitoba at 18.1%, Saskatchewan at 17%, Newfoundland and Labrador at 9.3%, and then Alberta at 6.8%. So population growth slows among First Nations people with registered Treaty Indian status, Métis and Inuit, compared to with 5 years previously. So while the Indigenous population continues to grow faster than the non-Indigenous population, the Indigenous population grew by 9.4% versus the non-Indigenous population at 5.3%, so almost twice as fast. This growth was not quite as large as we had seen in previous censuses. So for example, from 2011 to 2016, we saw 18.9% growth in the Indigenous population versus we saw 9.4. So that growth rate is almost half. Now, there could be a lot of reasons for this. It's not just a change in births or something like that. There's what's called response mobility with how people respond on the census. That might have changed. We might not have seen as much of that from 2016 to 2021 as was seen in 2011 to 2016. So here we have the growth rates between the two periods, the 2011 to 2016 in the dark blue, and the 2016 to 2021 in the light blue. And we see here it was for the total Indigenous population, here for the total First Nations population, here for First Nations people with registered or treaty status, here for First Nations people without registered or treaty status, here for Métis, and here for Inuit. We see declines mostly, except for First Nations people without registered or treaty status, which grew quite a bit. There might have been some differences in, say, Eastern Canada with how we see a decline in growth among Métis and an increase in First Nations without treaty registered or treaty status. That's something we'll be kind of looking into in the future. Whereas the growth rate for Inuit was pretty constant. So here we have an age pyramid for the Indigenous population in Canada by gender. We see this green line is what the non-Indigenous population is. So you can see this bulge here. Those are the baby boomers. Then you got kind of the lull of Gen X, and then the millennials here is kind of the baby boom echo. And then you got the echo, where you kind of see those trends a bit. Like here you have among the Indigenous population, kind of the baby boomers, but then you see it's a much younger population here. So the average age of the Indigenous population was 33.6 years compared to 41.8 years among non-Indigenous people. And we saw that the youngest average age was among Inuit at 28.9 years, followed by First Nations people at 32.5 years, and then Métis at 35.9 years. Now, despite the relative youth of the Indigenous population, the share of Indigenous people who are age 65 and older continues to grow. So from 2016 to 2021, over those 5 years, the share of Indigenous people age 65 years and older rose from 7.3 to 9.5%. So quite a bit, whereas the share of young children aged 0 to 4 was slightly smaller, declining to 7.6% from 8.7. For the first time, the Census of Population counted over 1 million First Nations people living in Canada. While more than half of First Nations people lived in Western Canada, 55% lived in the Western provinces. Ontario had the largest number of First Nations people provincially at over 250,000, which represented just under 1/4 of the First Nations population in Canada. 1 in 9 First Nations people lived in Quebec. 7.6% lived in Atlantic Canada, and the remaining 1.9% of First Nations people lived in the territories. Almost 3/4, 71.8% of First Nations people reported having status under the Indian Act, while 28.2% did not. The proportion of First Nations people with status was higher in 2016 at 76.2%. This reflects kind of the higher growth that we saw among the First Nations population of First Nations people who reported not having status. Here we have some fairly tragic statistics. This was kind of over the news as one of a main finding from the census release, and that's unfortunately First Nations children represent a disproportionate share of all children in foster care. So the census looks at private households. Unfortunately, we aren't able to look at, say, collective dwellings. So this only captures a portion of foster care children, but we see that Indigenous among children aged 0 to 14, 3.2% of Indigenous children were in foster care compared to 0.2% of non-Indigenous children. And among First Nations children, 4.1% lived in foster care. So here we see on a pie chart of foster care in private households, the gray is non-Indigenous people, and the blue is First Nations children, and the green is in Métis and Inuit children. And we see just it's unfortunately the majority of children that are in foster care. Now, moving on to Métis, we saw that over 250,000 Métis live in Ontario and Quebec. The Métis population was counted at 624,220. This growth was 6.3%. And 224,655 reported membership in a Métis organization or settlement. So here we have kind of a map of Canada and the population that identified themselves as Métis and what share of the total Métis population that was. So primarily in provinces Ontario and West. So going into a bit on the data from the new question, for the Métis Nation, British Columbia, we saw that 27,135 reported being members of the Métis Nation of British Columbia, with 94% of them living in British Columbia. About half of those who reported being a member of MNBC lived in Vancouver, followed by Prince George, Victoria, Kelowna, Kamloops, and Nanaimo. Moving east to Alberta, 127,475 people in Alberta identified as Métis, with over 45,000 identifying themselves as a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta. 93% of MNA members lived in Alberta and 7% lived elsewhere in Canada. And just under half of those who reported membership lived in Edmonton or Calgary, with wood buffalo and red deer also having more than 1,000 reported members of MNA. For the settlements, we saw 3,540 people reporting belonging to one of the Alberta Métis settlements. 96% of Alberta settlement members reported living in Alberta, while 4% lived elsewhere in Canada. Members were reported living in Edmonton, Grand Prairie, Ottawa, Gatineau, Vancouver, Calgary, Lloydminster, and Sylvan Lake. For Métis Nation Saskatchewan, we saw 26,695 people reporting membership. 87% of MNS members lived in Saskatchewan, with 13% living elsewhere in Canada. That was the highest share among the signatories of the Canada Métis Nation Accord to live outside of the associated province. And we saw over 4 in 10 MNS members lived in Saskatoon, Prince Albert, and Regina. The Manitoba Métis Federation reported 43,920 people reported membership to the Manitoba Métis Federation, with 88% of those living in Manitoba. That was the second highest after Métis Nation of Alberta. Winnipeg had the largest number of people registered to a Métis organization or settlement within Manitoba and Canada overall, with about half of those reporting being registered to MMF, living in Winnipeg, and a further 1,000 reported living in Brandon, 1,100. Métis Nation Ontario, 36,240 people reported belonging to the Métis Nation of Ontario, with 89% living in Ontario. And relative to the other signatories of the Canada Métis Nation Accord, those reporting being registered to MNO were relatively dispersed across Ontario, with a third of them living in cities of Toronto, Ottawa, Greater Sudbury, Midland, Windsor, Thunder Bay, and Sault Ste. Marie. We saw that more than 2/3 of Inuit live in Inuit Nunangat, but the Inuit population outside Inuit Nunangat is growing quickly. So there was 70,545 people that reported being Inuit on the census. That was a growth rate of 8.5%. And we saw that 69% lived in Inuit Nunangat. Here we have the different regions of Inuit Nunangat, with the Inuvialuit region and 3,145 people living there, Inuit living there, 30,865 Inuit living in Nunavut, 12,590 Inuit living in Nunavik, and 2,095 living in Nunatsiavut, and 21,825 living outside of Inuit Nunangat. Now, we, as mentioned, we have a new question on enrollment under an Inuit land claims agreement. We saw that 60,865 people reported being enrolled under an Inuit land claims agreement. So that made up 80.6% of Inuit in Canada. Here we have the agreements, so enrollment under the agreements, as well as where they're living in Inuit Nunangat, each region, Nunatsiavut, Nunavik, Nunavut, Inuvialuit region, and outside Inuit Nunangat. And we see that, for example, there was 6,390 Inuit registered to the Labrador Inuit Land Claims Agreement, but only 2,090 of those lived in So we see here that the shares of below that were living in the associated region of Inuit Nunagat was highest in Nunavut and lowest in Nunatsiavut. The Indigenous population continues to grow in large urban centers. More than 800,000 Indigenous people lived in a large urban center, so a city with more than 100,000 people. Um, and that the Indigenous population living in a large urban center grew by 12.5%, with the share of Indigenous people living in a large urban center rose from 43% to 44% of Indigenous people. Winnipeg had the largest population at 102,000, followed by Edmonton at 87,600, then Vancouver at 63,000. So as mentioned, low-income data is available for the first time for all communities, including First Nations reserves and northern communities. Now, the 2021 census was a bit interesting for income data. In 2020, there was a lot of, when looking at income data, it's about the year previous. So in 2021, the income data is about what you earned in 2020. And 2020 was an interesting year. There's a lot of government transfers, such as the CERB program and all that. And not just among the Indigenous population, but among the entire population of Canada generally, um, we saw a fairly drastic drop in low income rates. Now, it'll be interesting to see whether how this looks in 2021, 22, 23 going forward, whether that was just a blip drop with those government transfers or whether it's potentially long lasting. But we saw a decline in low income rates generally. Unfortunately, we still see higher rates of low income among Indigenous people, specifically among First Nations people residing on reserve, at almost a third, as well as higher rates in parts of Inuit Nunagat. And part of that doesn't even fully capture the high cost of goods that can be in remote reserves and in northern Inuit Nunagat communities. So the proportion of Indigenous people living in crowded conditions declined, as well as the proportion needing in major repairs declined. However, it still remains quite a bit higher than the non-Indigenous population. We saw these declines in housing in need of repair and crowded dwelling across the board, on reserve for First Nations and off reserve for First Nations. And while the gap shrank a little bit, as mentioned, it's still a lot higher. And among Inuit and Inuit Nunagat, unfortunately, we saw an increase in the percentage of dwellings in need of major repair. Now, there's a tremendous diversity in Indigenous languages. 237,420 Indigenous people in Canada could speak an Indigenous language well enough to conduct a conversation. Unfortunately, between 2016 and 2021, the number of Indigenous people who reported that they could speak an Indigenous language declined by 4.3%. And this reflected kind of a decline in the number of mother tongue speakers. So those that spoke an Indigenous language as the first language that they learned. However, there was quite a bit of growth in the number of second language speakers. So those who are learning an Indigenous language later in life, as their second language. We've seen quite a bit of growth in that. We saw the mother tongue population decline by 8.1%, while the second language population grew by 7%. So we are seeing some positive signs, but unfortunately still we're seeing net declines in Indigenous language speakers. Now, in closing, I'd just like to mention that this is the 5th release of the 2021 census results. There's still data to come that'll, such as on October 26th, we release immigration, religion, ethnocultural, so diversity as well as mobility data. On November 30th, we're releasing education data, and there'll be more products and analysis to come beyond. So stay tuned for future releases. And Statistics Canada would like to thank First Nations, Métis and Inuit communities for responding to the 2021 census population. And I'd like to thank you for your attention and for having the honor of being able to present these census results. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Well, thank you so much, Henry. Very thorough. So this data, this piece of data was released just a couple of weeks ago. Did I hear that correctly?
1 week ago today.
Wow. And here you are presenting it. Well, thank you so much for taking your time to be here. This is a great opportunity for anyone who has any questions. Kathleen, I don't know if you wanted to jump in, and I know you had wrote in the chat box as well. But yeah, we're going to open the floor to anyone who has any questions for Kathleen or Henry. We would love to hear from you.
I just wanted to let everyone know that in preparation for the 2021 census, Statistics Canada did consult with census data users to assess their needs and to identify data gaps. They wanted to understand how census data are used and identify other data sources that could supplement or replace the current census content. So as a result of those discussions, Statistics Canada did work with First Nation, Métis and Inuit partners to better understand the needs of Indigenous organizations and communities. And as a result of those discussions, the 2021 census included 2 new questions that Henry touched on and gave the data for. But the 2 new questions were membership in a Métis organization or settlement, and enrollment under or beneficiary of an Inuit land claim agreement. And also on another note, and we didn't touch on this data analysis in this presentation, however, but just in the spirit of sharing, Canada is the first country in the world to provide census data on transgender and non-binary people. So prior to the 2021 census, some individuals indicated to us that they were not able to see themselves in the 2 responses of male or female in the existing sex question in the census. So starting in 2021, the precision of at birth was added to the sex question on the census questionnaire, and a new question on gender was included. So as a result, the historical continuity of information on sex is maintained while allowing all cisgender, transgender, and non-binary individuals to report their gender. So this addressed an important information gap on gender diversity. And I'm highlighting this for your information because we're starting the regional discussions for 2026. So commencing in October and November, Statistics Canada will be hosting regional discussions throughout Canada. I will be hosting 3 within Alberta. BC also will be hosting regional discussions. So if you would like to be involved in the creation of, new content for the census, if you have any feedback at all, I strongly encourage you to get in touch with me, and I will be sure to send you an invitation to a regional discussion. And I'm going to include my email address in the chat box. So thank you very much for your really awesome presentation, Henry, and very informative for everybody, I hope. And if anybody has any questions for Henry, thank you very much. Let's hear it.
Yeah, just want to say first, thanks so much for bringing up the gender diversity information. That's a really crucial point that I didn't touch upon. In the daily, we do actually have a bit of information for how it gender diversity among the Indigenous population, and there's some interesting findings there among non-binary identity and among youth too.
Great. So Kathleen's going to put her contact information in the chat box. Thank you for doing that. Henry, I believe this presentation, this PowerPoint is going to be sent to our participants. I think you're sending it to Elsie. So you all will have access to this as well to look over. I mean, particularly the one thing that stood out to me was the language piece, that you were kind of able to capture how many, of our people still, know their language, speak their language. I don't know if that was a low number though. Kathleen, do you have any thoughts? I thought it was like 240,000. I don't know if that's low or if that's a good number.
Well, I think the important takeaway from it is that our information is primarily used, or a lot of the important uses of it is in funding proposals. And I think what we're seeing right now is a lot of language revitalization programs happening right now. And so I think that that's the key, and one of the most important takeaways from the numbers that you're seeing is the data that was presented here today. If there's any way that we can support you further with any of the excellent work anybody is doing, we're happy to do it. And again, my email is there for you. Just reach out, and we'll put you in touch with the right information to help you out.
Excellent. Excellent. I think, language revitalization is so important when you have the numbers and you have the statistics to go with, if you're writing a grant for a grant or getting some funding for that, that's really important. That's really great. Really great. So does anyone have any questions? We'd love to hear from you. You can unmute yourself. You can put it in the chat box. I think you've given us lots to think about. I particularly also liked that map, and to see, the numbers, and Winnipeg has a lot of urban Indigenous folks. The number was astounding to me. So
yeah, it's like 1 in 7 people in Winnipeg, that's a pretty large share.
Yeah, that is. And it's cool because there's this urban, I cannot remember the name of it, but there's this urban reserve that's being really birthed and flourished. And so it's really cool to see that that's happening in Winnipeg. And it's so important that it's happening in Winnipeg. So really great. Okay, well, it doesn't seem like there's any questions. So we thank both of you so much for being here, lending your time, showing us the census results, the release. We feel very honored that you could be here and do that. So thank you all for joining. Oh, she came on camera, or you came on camera? Do you have a question? Or you just want to give a little wave?
No, I just wanted to give a little wave and a thank you for this. I really enjoyed this, and yeah.
Awesome, thank you. I always love to see the faces of those who show up for our virtual knowledge sharing moment. So thank you, it's good to see you. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you have a good rest of the day. Take a moment for yourself, take a moment with Creator, and acknowledge the goodness that is around you. All of our relations, all our relatives are surrounding us. All right, well, take care, be well, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
For everybody.